Well, I want to tell you this morning, I'm excited to be here. It has been a weekend that I've been looking forward to for some time. This is a topic that, of course, I think is important to each and every one of us. Hopefully it is. It's important to us because God's design for the home, the way that He chose for homes to be constructed is so important. And if any element in that design is missing and is not there and is not functioning as God designed it to be, then there's issues and there's problems in the home. And so this weekend, we're not trying to marginalize the mother at all. I want you to know that mothers and fathers are both extremely important in the development of children, in bringing up children that will be good Christian men and women. But this weekend's focus is on the father. As the head of the family, God has called the father to lead that charge of raising up children to be the kind of people that God has called them to be. So I want to start with Psalm 127. My topic is specifically on the importance of the fathers, and so hopefully it will serve as an introduction for these other speakers to get up and talk about specific aspects of whether a father is not being godly or the father is being a spiritual leader and the legacy that a father can lead. And so hopefully this will serve as a good introduction. So in Psalm 127, 3 and 4, the psalmist here writes, "Lo, children are a heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is His reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth." And here in this psalm, I want us to recognize that he compares children to arrows. First of all, he says children are a heritage of the Lord, a blessing from the Lord. And certainly I feel blessed that I have two children. If you're a parent in the audience this morning, I'm sure you feel blessed, and I hope you feel blessed that you have children. I know children can be tough at times. Children can be fun. They can be interesting. They can bring challenges to us. But there's so much joy and so much fun that can come as well from having children, and so much blessing. And the Lord has blessed us to be able to be parents and to raise children. But I want us to notice here, he uses this illustration of a mighty man, of a warrior that has his arrow drawn. And I want you to picture in your minds that warrior that's got that bow and that arrow in his hand, and he's aiming that arrow at a specific target. He's trying to hit something just right. And so he's putting just the right amount of pressure on his pull, and he's aiming it, and he's adjusting for wind and all of the other conditions there. And as he releases that arrow, he is hoping and he is praying that that arrow finds its mark. And this is the illustration of a father and his children. That just as a warrior with that arrow in his hand is seeking for that arrow to hit its target and hit its mark, so we as fathers of our families ought to be preparing and training our children and sending them out into the world, hoping and praying and training them and preparing them to meet that mark and to hit that mark. And we ought to have a mark visualized in our mind. We ought to have a target for where we want our children to be. And I want to ask you this morning, if you're a father, have you visualized what you want for your children once they're not in your home anymore? Have you visualized what you want their adult life to look like? And no, I don't mean that they go to a great college. I don't mean that they have a good job. I don't mean that they marry the right kind of woman or the right kind of man or give you grandkids. All of those things are great. But I mean, have you visualized the type of person, the character of your child that you want them to demonstrate as an adult? Because if they demonstrate the right kind of character as an adult, then all those other things, the good job, the good decisions in choosing a spouse, the raising grandchildren that are good people, all of that will come if their character is right. So where are you pointing them? Where are you aiming them? The reality is fathers are extremely important. As the arrow is in the hand of a mighty man or of a warrior, so are the children in the hands of their father. And you can direct so much of where they land as adults. Now we recognize, of course, that there's free will and people can grow up and become adults and they can make their own decisions. But the Scripture, of course, teaches that we as fathers have the responsibility to prepare them and to train them. And that such a huge factor in where our children end up as an adults has to do with how we raise them and train them. And I want you to know that there is an enemy out there that is seeking to stop you from raising godly children. And there is a spiritual war that is raging around us, whether we realize it or not. And sometimes we get into a habit and a flow in our life where we're enjoying things and we're on vacation and we're participating in our hobbies and we're just enjoying life. And we forget that we're soldiers. We forget that we're in a battle. And our enemy doesn't forget. Satan's not forgetting. Satan is always there seeking to devour those that he can get his hands on. And that includes us. And that includes our children. 1 Peter 5 verse 8 says, "Be sober. Be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour." Satan is ever present. He's walking around seeking whom he may devour. He's looking for you and he's looking for your children. And he's hoping to distract you as a father, to keep you from aiming that arrow to the right mark. He's hoping to distract you, but he's also hoping to lure away your children who are not as mature and not as knowledgeable as you are. And it's your responsibility to stop that from happening. I want you to recognize too, though, that Satan's not alone. We talk about Satan, but Satan's not like God. Satan's not everywhere all at once. Satan is a singular being. And that singular being is not the only enemy that we have to deal with. In fact, Satan has a host of spiritual forces that are behind him, that he uses in those attacks and in this spiritual war that's raging. Ephesians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus here in verse 11, he said, "Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand." And I want you to know this morning, we're going to talk about the armor of God in just a moment, but I just want us to recognize from this passage first all of the different help that Satan has. That word principalities there and powers, those essentially are describing the ranks of the spiritual forces that Satan has at his command and at his disposal. And those principalities, those are the chieftains, those are the rulers in those spiritual forces that he has that wages war against you. There is spiritual wickedness in this world. We can look around at our culture and our society and we can see the moral decline that has taken place, and it's been mentioned already this weekend. We can see the decay of those morals. What do you think is behind that? You think it's just people? Or do you think that there's spiritual forces behind those attacks waging war against God and against righteousness and against truth? If you don't realize that you're in a war, then Satan has you exactly where he wants you. You are soldiers, brothers and sisters, in the war against Satan and against evil and against unrighteousness and against falsehood. And your children, it is your responsibility to make sure they don't end up pawns being used by Satan in that war. And it's your responsibility that you keep yourself the type of person that God has called you to be, so that you can be fully focused and not distracted from the mission that God has given you as a father. How do we fight this spiritual war? It's not a war against flesh and blood. And Paul makes this point in 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5. He says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ." You know how we fight against this attack and this battle that Satan brings on us? We do it here. We do it with the mind. That word imagination there means reasoning or arguments. That we fight against false reasoning and arguments and we cast them down. That we cast down and get rid of every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. Every manifestation of pride that we must stay away from. Every thought, that we bring every thought that comes into our mind under the obedience of Christ. What about your children, though? That's fine for you and I. We can focus on ourselves. But don't your children have to learn those things? Don't your children have to learn how to take their thoughts captive? Don't your children have to learn not to be prideful, but to be humble? Don't your children have to learn not to be swayed by false lines of reasoning and arguments, these imaginations that are mentioned here? Certainly they do. And that's your job as a father, is to lead the charge in training them in how to fight against Satan, to fight the falsehoods that are in the world. And brothers and sisters, there's a lot of them. We talk about the decay of moral issues in our country. And you'll hear the phrase sometimes, people say, well, it's just a different world than it was in the 1950s. Well, yeah, it is, but it's a different world than it was when I was a teenager. It's a different world than it was 15 years ago. And I want to show you the decline that has taken place in some of these issues just in the past 16 to 18 years. And you can see on the screen some of the issues that we're going to talk about. Those first two, drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana, Gallup didn't keep track of the numbers that far back. But I want you to recognize that 79% of Americans approve of the use of drinking alcohol. 65% of Americans today approve of smoking of marijuana. And then in these other issues, we can see the comparison. In 2001 to 2002, 7% of America believed it was okay to be unfaithful in your marriage. That's risen to 10% that approve of that today. 38% of America in 2001 to 2002 believed that abortion was moral. 43% of them believe that today. It's risen. Suicide was considered moral by 12% of people in 2001 to 2002. Now that's at 20%. Unmarried sexuality, 53% said that was moral back in 2001, 2002. That's now up to 71%. They consider that moral. Divorce considered moral by 59% of the world 16 to 18 years ago. Now it's of this country. Now it's 77%. Believe divorce is moral. 45% said it's okay to have a baby outside of marriage in 2001 to 2002. Now 65% believe that that's moral. 38% in 2001 to 2002 said homosexual relationships are moral. That's risen to 67% today. And then these last two, they didn't keep track that far, but you go back to 2011, that was only 8 years ago. In 2011, 30% of the country believed that pornography and viewing pornography was a moral thing to do, and that's risen to 43% in just 8 years. And just 6 years ago, in 2013, 32% of America said teenage sexuality was moral. 6 years later, that's risen by 10 percentage points to 42%. It's a different world than it was in the 1950s. It's a different world than it was 15 years ago. The decay is happening, and it's not really a laughing matter, is it? We can see the decline. And if you've not realized that that decline is happening, then you're in for a scary awakening another 15 years from now. Because if things continue going the way that they are, it will be that much worse. And that scares me. When my kids are 15 years older, what's the world going to look like then? When my kids are trying to raise their kids, what are they battling against? Brothers and sisters, the war is there. It's happening. It's raging around us. What are we doing to fight it? Our children are being caught up in the middle of these things. Our children are watching shows that glorify suicide. They're watching TV shows and movies that glorify sexuality outside of marriage. They're seeing these things portrayed. They have peers, they have friends, they have other influences, people that are telling them that these things are okay, these things are moral. What are we doing as fathers? What are we doing to step up and to lead our families and to change the narrative? That these things aren't the things of God, they aren't the things of righteousness. These things are lines of reasonings and arguments that need to be cast down. These things are manifestations of pride that need to be destroyed. These things are thoughts that have not been taken captive and put under the obedience of Christ, but have been carried through to fruition, to exactly where it is, to the end degree of where it can take you. Your children are growing up in a world where homosexual relationships are considered normal, where gender identity is fluid, where suicide is glorified, where drug use is common, drinking alcohol among teenagers is common. All of these things your children are having to deal with. What are you doing about it? Now, the reaction by some is, well, we need to take our kids and we need to put them in a closet somewhere and keep them away from everything. You know why that's not helpful? Because then they don't actually learn how to deal with it. You put them away in a box somewhere and you keep them away from everything, then you send them off, you shoot that arrow off into the world, it's not going to hit its mark. Because the wind is going to catch that arrow and it's going to take it away from its target because they're not going to have learned how to make good decisions and discern between good and evil. And if you don't prepare them and train them to do that on their own, they're going to fail. And you're going to sit back and wonder what happened. What happened was you didn't teach them how to deal with the issue, you just removed them from it. Now, don't get me wrong, there may be a time when removal from a situation is necessary, but for the most part, we need to be focused not on removing them from knowledge of something, but teaching them how to deal with it. Teaching them how to cast that imagination down, how to remove that manifestation of pride, how to take that thought, that line of reasoning captive. That's what God is calling us as fathers to do, to train them and to teach them. The battle is on. The war is raging. Are we fighting in it? Are we stepping up and leading our families as God has called you to? And I want to encourage fathers today to step up and to lead. Ephesians chapter 5:23, the scripture says, "For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body." Sometimes we don't like it. There may be men in the crowd that say, I wish that wasn't the case, but God has placed you as the head of the family. There may be women and mothers in the audience that don't like it. There may be women and mothers in the audience that are having to take the lead because fathers aren't. That's not the design that God put in front of us. What God said was that husbands and fathers are to take the lead. Now, husbands and fathers, along with mothers and wives, they are to work together as a team in raising their children. But it's on the responsibility on the shoulders of the father to make sure that his home is operating the way that God has designed it to be. Now, recognize the head there, even though it means anything supreme, chief, prominent, master, Lord, and we joke a lot of times, Sarah called Abraham Lord. Wouldn't that be nice? Recognize that head there, that doesn't mean a domineering husband. That doesn't mean a husband that doesn't listen to his wife. Remember, the illustration here is Christ and the church. How Christ treats the church. Christ died for the church. He gave His all for the church. He provides for and protects and nourishes and encourages the church. And that's the type of leader that a husband ought to be. But the reality is, you're the head. God has called you the head of the family. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4 says, "Ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord." Now, certainly mothers bring their children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord as well. But this scripture, Paul specifically points out the need for fathers to make sure that they are bringing them up. Nurture there means education or training. Admonition means instruction or warning. That we are teaching and preparing our children, and that's at the feet of the fathers to do that. So I want to go through some responsibilities that God has given to you as a father this morning. God has called you as a father to provide for your children. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8 says, "But if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel." Now, while this verse is more in context talking about children taking care of their older family members, certainly the reverse is true as well. We recognize the need as a family to provide for those that are under our care. And if a father is not willing to provide for his family and provide for his children, if a father is lazy, if you are not fulfilling that responsibility, recognize the hardship that places on your child. When you don't fulfill the responsibility to provide, your child suffers. And your child will grow up seeing that example of laziness, suffering by lack of having the things that they need, and that will affect them for life. You want to shoot that arrow at the right target? Fulfill the responsibility God's called you to do and provide for your children. But not just provision. God's called you to love and to spend time with your children. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 12 says, "For whom the Lord loveth, He correcteth, even as a father the son in whom He delighteth." Do you delight in your children? I was reading this verse and thinking about it and just playing through my mind all of the great times that I have with my boys. And we do, and we have some great times. I delight in my sons. I delight in the time that we have to spend together. I delight in the things that they come up with that surprise me and that make me laugh, the things that they do. But I also delight in the fact when I see them do something good, when I see them do something right, when I see them taking in some of the learning and taking in some of the training and I see some of that application happening. I delight in that. I love my boys. Do you love your kids? It's natural to love your kids. But unfortunately, sometimes actions don't show that. Sometimes words don't show that. And I want to encourage you as dads, make sure your kids know that you love them. Because your kids are looking to you. And your showing love or saying the words, "I love you," means a lot in the development of your child. To be able to look at dad and know without a doubt that he's got your back, that he cares about you, that he loves you, helps a child grow up with confidence, helps instill self-esteem and self-confidence in them. But a child that doesn't show that, a father that doesn't show that, creates a child that grows up wondering why, or if their father loves them. And that's certainly not the way that we want our children to grow up. God has called you to delight in your children, to love your children. He's also called you to spend time with them. I like this verse in Deuteronomy 6, verse 7. This is the Lord talking to the children of Israel and instructing them to take that old law. And He speaks to fathers here in this verse. He says, "Thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up." And you go and you read that whole passage. And essentially, God is saying, everywhere that you are and in everything that you're doing, you're talking about the law. You're teaching the law. But I also recognize that takes time. That takes diligence. And make New Testament application of that. As fathers, we're seeking to teach our children the things that Jesus has commanded. We're seeking to teach them the things of God, the things of righteousness. We're teaching against those moral issues and the acceptance of those immoral things that we talked about. And that takes time. It takes diligence. If you're not spending time with your children, you're losing out on opportunities to train them and to teach them. And if your child grows up and doesn't ever learn how to make good decisions and ends up turning away from the church, free will, of course, is there and people can make their own decisions. But if you look back and you say, I didn't really spend much time, then that was probably a factor. Because teaching the things of God takes time and diligence. Are you spending time with your children? Are you taking every opportunity that you can? Proverbs 22, verse 6, God has called you as fathers to train up your children and instruct them. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. That training, that preparation as a soldier in this battle that we are fighting against Satan, that takes diligence, it takes effort, it takes time. Correction is going to be a part of that process. God has called you to discipline and correct your children. Proverbs 13, verse 24 says, He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. That chasteneth him betimes there, that's some good old-fashioned King James, isn't it? Rebuking them or correcting them diligently is what that phrase means. That you are diligent about correcting them, about rebuking them when they do something wrong, about disciplining them. You know what happens to a child that's not corrected and that's not disciplined? They grow up not ever knowing boundaries. They grow up not understanding the morality of things and right and wrong and the ability to make those decisions. And they grow up and they're a part of the statistics that we showed. Because they end up believing that anything's okay. And whatever they feel and whatever passion they have that leads them, whatever lust is in their heart, that's what they need to follow. Correction and discipline is important. And God has called you as fathers to correct. And I want you to recognize that you are going to see your children make mistakes. It's going to happen. Even if you're diligent about training them and about teaching them, they are going to mess up. What are you going to do when they mess up? Are you going to blow your top? Are you going to lose it? Are you going to overreact to a point that you crush them, to a point where you lose trust with them, to a point where they no longer want to come to you if they do need to talk to you about something or admit something to you or ask you a question about something because they're afraid of what you're going to say, they're afraid of how you're going to react, and so your children end up growing up in fear of really ever having those real conversations because they're not sure what you're going to do? Your children are going to mess up. Don't overreact. Don't lose it. Don't crush that trust that you've spent time building with them. Hear them out. Sit down with them. Listen to them. And then be real with them and talk through those issues that they need to talk about. Because if you're not willing to sit down and talk with them about it, they will find someone else who is. And that other person may not have the same advice that you have. That other person may not be teaching them the principles of God as you would seek to. So know that correction is a part of it. And do it right. God has called you to prepare your children for adulthood. As we mentioned in the beginning, you are that warrior with that arrow in your hand. You are seeking to send your children off and hope that they hit that target that you have for them, that you have visualized for them. A person of good character who loves the Lord, who loves the church. That's what you're trying to create. You've got to prepare them to be able to do that on their own, to be able to discern between good and evil, as Hebrews 5 and verse 14 talks about. And this passage, of course, is talking about warning against false teachings and that we need to be maturing and growing spiritually and not be in the milk of the Word, but be in the meat of the Word. But I want us to recognize the application here for our children and as we're raising them. That we need to raise children who are mature enough to discern between good and evil as they enter into the world. It does no good to maintain an attitude of, as long as my children are obeying me, they're good. I've done my job. As long as they were obeying me at 5, as long as they were obeying me at 12, as long as they were obeying me at 17, I'm good. It doesn't work that way. You may have them under your thumb. You may have them saying yes, sir, and yes, ma'am. But what happens when they're no longer in your house? What happens when they've got to make a decision on their own? And you're not there to tell them what to do. What do they do then? You know the answer to that. So I want to encourage you. When they're young, yes, it's important that they obey you. And that can be the end of the story when they're young. But as they grow up, they need to go from eating milk to eating meat. You need to encourage that maturity and teach them how to make those decisions for themselves. If you want them to be good adults, you need to seek to turn your child into that adult that you want them to be. And that's going to take mistakes that they make. It's going to take you having to step back at times and let them make decisions that you're scared to let them make, and then to guide them and to coach them with that relationship that you've created. Folks, eventually they're going to be gone. You're not going to have them. they're going to have to do this on their own. Are you preparing them for that? And then God has called you to model godly character and behavior. I want us to recognize what Proverbs 10 verse 9 says. He that walketh uprightly walketh surely, but he that perverteth his ways shall be known. Let me tell you what will destroy all of the training and preparation that you're doing with your children. That's if they see in you hypocrisy. If they see that you are not modeling the things that you are telling them, it will destroy your credibility. Why should they listen to you about the decisions that they should make if you yourself are not even making those decisions? If they see sin and poor behavior and bad attitudes and bitterness and other things in your life, then why in the world are they not going to end up doing the same? The most important example is the father's example in the home. Your children are looking to you as the spiritual leader of the home to set that example for them. If you set the wrong one, that's what they're going to see, and that's what they're going to imitate. And I want to encourage you, maintain your credibility with them by being who you need to be and making sure that you are modeling for them those things that you want them to do and that you're teaching them to do. I want us to recognize in our culture today, fathers have been intentionally marginalized. I don't know if you've noticed that. And it actually has potentially been getting a little better. Because fathers in this country, not just Christian fathers, but fathers in this country are recognizing the very poor portrayal of our role when it comes to media, when it comes to TV, when it comes to movies, when it comes to commercials. But there has been an intentional effort to marginalize the importance of the father in the home. And I want to give you a few examples. Sarah Peterson, who's a journalist for the Deseret News in Salt Lake City, Utah, wrote an article. She said, if you watch TV, you've most likely witnessed the portrayal of the modern-day husband and father as lazy, incompetent, and dumb. Just these three characteristics are sure to bring to mind one commercial or sitcom that personifies this type of man. And as you're sitting in the audience this morning and you're thinking about shows that you have seen, you're thinking about movies that you have seen, probably you can think of a few examples of fathers in TV shows or in sitcoms that come off as totally incompetent, that come off as foolish, that come off as lazy. And we laugh about it, and it's funny, and it's all done with laughs and all that. But really, what that does is it marginalizes the importance of the father in the family. And if children are watching those shows, and they're seeing fathers portrayed that way, fathers are portrayed as not being worthy of respect, then why should they have respect for their father? If wives and mothers are growing up in a culture and what they're constantly seeing is that fathers aren't important to the raising of their children, then that minimizes the impact that a father can then have. Christopher A. Brown's the president of the National Fatherhood Initiative. And he said this about this issue. He said, fathers are still often portrayed by consumer brands as one extreme or the other. On the one side, fathers are shown as incompetent, foolish, and emotionally disconnected as parents. The double standard involves competent, wise, emotionally connected mothers who must often rescue those fathers. And that's what we see too often. The reality is, mothers shouldn't be marginalized, and fathers shouldn't be marginalized. But what we should be seeing is that both roles are extremely important in the development of our children. And guess why? Because that's the way God designed it. But if you can't think of any example of this, or you're just thinking, well, Timothy, you're just making too big a deal about this, I understand. But I want to share with you a commercial that I did find humorous, but also illustrates the point. There was a Huggies ad, 2012, you may have seen it. And it shows these dads playing with their babies. And then this voiceover comes on and says, to prove Huggies can handle just about anything, we put them to the toughest test imaginable. Dads alone with their babies in one house for 5 days. Now recognize the subtle message that this is sending. The toughest test imaginable, the worst thing possible, dads being alone with their babies. I mean, call CPS. The mother left the baby with the dad. Come on, this is terrible. How dare she? And this is silliness, and we laugh. And it's funny. The reality is, all it's doing is subverting God's design. And as insignificant and unimportant as it may seem to us, every single one of these subtle messages that undermines the importance of fathers hurts the family unit. And it hurts the level of respect that children have for their fathers. And it hurts the impact that fathers can make. when in reality the research shows us that while society and culture may be wanting to intentionally marginalize dads, that dads are extremely important in the development of their children, and they have a tremendous impact on them. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, as of 2017, there are 19.7 million children, more than 1 in 4, who live without a father in the home. Who live without any type of father in the home. These children are more likely to have behavioral problems, more likely to face abuse and neglect, more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, more likely to commit crime, more likely to go to prison. They're 2 times greater risk of infant mortality, at 4 times greater risk of poverty, 2 times more likely to suffer from obesity, 2 times more likely to drop out of high school, 7 more times likely to become a teenage parent when they grow up without a father in the home. You think fathers aren't important? You think it's okay to just marginalize dads and say dads aren't important in the home? The research backs up what Scripture has said. That fathers standing up and leading their homes and training and preparing their children is extremely important and valuable. 100 studies on parent-child relationships found that having a loving and nurturing father was as important for a child's happiness, well-being, and social and academic success as having a loving and nurturing mother. Some studies even indicated father love was a stronger contributor to some important positive child well-being outcomes. You know why the research indicates that fathers are just as important, and in some studies, more important to the development of their children? Because as we use scientific research and these type of studies, what we'll eventually find is that it backs up what Scripture says. It backs up God's design. And God's design for fathers and mothers working together and raising their children, fathers in taking the lead in doing that, in being important, not in being marginalized, but taking an active role in the raising and preparing of their children, is extremely valuable. And this isn't even talking about spiritual instruction. This is just talking about general success in life as we would define it. And children are so much better off when their fathers are involved. I want to look at a story in Scripture that we find out of 2 Samuel about David. But I want us to first, what's the first verse? As I was thinking about, what's the first verse that comes into my mind when I think about David? This one is what popped up. As we think about David, we think he's a man after God's own heart, right? Acts 13, verse 22. God said, I found a man after my own heart. David was a good man. I think we could agree with that. David did a lot of good things. David served the Lord. He stood up and he had faith when other people weren't. He did a lot of good things. He led God's people. He led that nation. He was a good king. David was a good man. But David had some failures as a father. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 2 through 3, it says, It came to pass in an evening tide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman. You remember what this story is, right? This is the story of David and Bathsheba. And David sees a woman that he wanted, that he had no right to, for she was married to somebody else, but he chose to go and pursue her and to take her and to have her. And he set a terrible example for his children. And you know what we find 2 chapters later? 2 Samuel 13 and verse 1. It says, It came to pass after this that Absalom, the son of David, had a fair sister whose name was Tamar. And Amnon, the son of David, loved her. You know, immediately after this story, in chapter 12, there is where Nathan confronts David. And then in chapter 13, you know what we find? David's firstborn son, Amnon, looking at his half-sister Tamar and desiring something that he shouldn't have. And in the preceding verses, you know what we find, or the next few verses, is that he goes and he forces her and he takes what he wants and he viciously attacks and violates his half-sister. And as I'm considering that story, I'm thinking, well, all Amnon had to do was go, my dad saw something that he wanted and he took it. Why shouldn't I? Because that's exactly the example that David set. Even though David was a good man, David was a good king, David set a poor example, and his firstborn son followed after him. Tamar put ashes on her head and rent her garment of diverse colors that was on her and laid her hand on her head and went on crying. That garment of diverse colors was a special garment that the virgin daughters of the king wore. And so she comes out of this vicious attack that she's been under and she tears that garment. She is distraught. She is crying. I wonder why. We can understand that, what she's just been through. And her father failed to protect her. Not only did he fail in setting a bad example, but he allowed he allowed his son to attack his daughter right underneath his nose. And the emotional and physical trauma that would have resulted from that, it's terrible. Another consequence, though, of this is that David's other son, Absalom, Tamar is his full-blooded sister. And Absalom isn't happy that Amnon has attacked his sister, obviously. And so Absalom, as you would expect, waits for King David to do something about it. And you know what King David does? Nothing. David was a good man. He's a good king. But he set a poor example, didn't protect his daughter, and then didn't hold Amnon accountable to his actions. Didn't provide justice, didn't provide any correction. You know what that did to Absalom? It allowed bitterness to fester. And 2 years later, Absalom murdered Amnon. And so you've got another one of King David's sons now murdering his brother, and the Scriptures very clearly tell us why. For Amnon only is dead, for by the appointment of Absalom hath this been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. For 2 years, Absalom stewed about the fact that nothing was ever done, and finally he took it into his own hands. And he killed his brother. All because King David set a poor example, failed to protect, didn't discipline and rebuke and provide justice and allow his children to see consequences. And you know what? David didn't even learn from that. Because a few years later, Absalom had exiled himself to the land of his mother, but a few years later, King David allows Absalom to come back. And he forgives him. And Absalom becomes his son again. And then for the next 4 years, right underneath the nose of David, Absalom subverts the people of Israel and turns their heart away from David and toward him. And he starts a revolution and a revolt against his father. And David was blind to the faults of his son. He didn't see what was right underneath his nose. He set a poor example. He failed to protect. He didn't correct, rebuke, or discipline or provide justice. And he was blind to his children's faults. And you know what happened as a result? After King David, that's him kissing Absalom and forgiving him, Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And Israel joined with Absalom. And they fought against King David. And David suffered a lot of hardships. David suffered a lot of loss in that story. And you can go read that story for yourself. But finally, when it all culminates in this great battle, David versus his son Absalom, David eventually comes out victorious. And he defeats his rebellious son. But you know what David's attitude was? 2 Samuel 19 verse 2, it says, "The victory that day was turned into mourning unto all the people, for the people heard say that day how the king was grieved for his son." Now that they turned to mourning, that doesn't mean they were sad for the king because they lost his son. They were sad for themselves. Because you see, these people had just fought and they had just lost comrades. They had fought for King David. They had saved the kingdom. And another verse in that chapter there has David saying, "O Absalom, my son, O Absalom, would that I had died for thee, O Absalom." And David is more distraught over the fact that Absalom was killed than that his kingdom was almost taken over. And Joab, his friend and commander of his armies, had to come to him and say, "What are you doing? All of these people just fought for you. You had people just die for you, and you're willing to destroy all of what they have done because you're sad about your rebellious son." And David had to listen to that advice and get up and go thank the people that had just fought for him so that he didn't lose his kingdom. He was about to lose everything for his rebellious son. And I just want us to recognize this morning, I see a lot of men in the crowd, I see a lot of fathers in the crowd today, and I dare say because you are here seeking to learn from this weekend that you are probably a good man. You're probably trying to be a man after God's own heart. You're probably trying to do the right things and be the right kind of person, just like David. David was a good person. David was a man after God's own heart. David was a good king. And you might be great at your job. You might be really, really good at what you do. But if you're not spending time with your kids, if you're not focusing and prioritizing raising them, you might fail just like David did. And I want you to know this morning that good men can be bad fathers. Good men who are trying to do good spiritual things and trying to be the kind of people that they need to be, if they're not intentional and purposeful with their parenting, they can end up losing their children as David did. Don't do that. Don't fail. Don't set a poor example. Don't fail to protect your children. Allow your kids to see consequences for their actions and don't be blind to their faults. Because if you are, your children will be worse off for it. Even though David was a good man, his failure as a father contributed greatly to the failures of his children, and so will yours. So will yours. Be the father that God has called you to be. Back to Ephesians chapter 6. We started at the beginning of this lesson, Ephesians chapter 6, talking about the principalities and powers and the rulers of the darkness of this world that we fight against the wiles of the devil. You know what Paul tells us in this passage? How that we can stand against that and fight against that? He says to put on the whole armor of God. But I want you to recognize this morning, that's not just important for you as fathers to put on the armor of God, but your job as a dad is essentially to prepare your children to put that armor on themselves, that you are helping equip your children to be soldiers in the fight. And as Paul writes here, wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand. Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, having on the breastplate of righteousness, your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace, above all taking the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. That's the equipment that you ought to have as a soldier in the Lord's army, but that's the same equipment that you need to be teaching your children, your sons and your daughters how to wield. You need to develop in them a love for the truth. You need to teach them the importance of making righteous decisions and how to make those decisions in your life. You need to teach them the importance of the gospel and being ready always to talk to somebody about the hope that is within us. You need to talk to your children and develop within them a faith that is strong and that is sure, that trusts in God for everything in life. You need to teach them the importance of salvation and help bring your children up to learn the love that God has for them and how He desires for them to be saved. And you need to put in the hands of your sons and your daughters the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. You as dad need to teach them how to wield that, to train them in the Word, to teach them a love for the Scriptures and a love for the Bible. This is how Paul says we stand against the wiles of the devil. This is how he says we fight against principalities and powers. Your children need to learn how to fight that fight. And that's up to you to put the sword in their hand. It's up to you to put the shield in their hand. It's up to you to put that helmet on their head, to put those shoes on their feet, and that belt around their waist. It's up to you to equip them to be soldiers in the army of the Lord. If you're not going to do it, who will? If you're not going to teach them to be soldiers and fight that fight, who's going to? Satan is winning. We have seen the decline over just the past 15 years. What is it going to take for us to stand up and say it ends here? As far as my family goes, this stops now. I will not let Satan win. I will not let his forces take my children. I will equip my children with the whole armor of God. I will be the example that God has called me to be. I will be the man of God that I'm supposed to be and set that example. And I will not fail them because my children are too precious. My children are too important to me. And I cannot fail them. I cannot allow this world to take them. They mean too much to me. And if I won't do that, who will? And if you won't do that for your children, who will? Are your children learning to put that armor on? Are they learning to fight that fight? Or are you sending that arrow off just wondering where it might hit? Are you sending them off into the world just wondering what they might become? Or are you being intentional and purposeful in their training? Your children are too important to leave to chance. Take the time. Seize the opportunity. Be the dad that God has called you to be. You are important. You are valuable. All of the research says it, but more importantly, the Scriptures say it. And God is calling you to be that father and to be that man. As we close this morning, I'm going to leave you with a story from history that I think we can learn something from. Charles Francis Adams was the grandson of John Adams, the son of John Quincy Adams. Charles Francis Adams was diligent every day about writing in his journal about the events of the day. He brought up 7 children. His 4th born child was named Henry Brooks. Henry got his love of taking a diligent journal every day from his father. And like his father, every day he wrote in that journal. And one day when Henry was 8 years old, after he had spent the day fishing with his father, he wrote this in his journal. Went fishing with my father today. The most glorious day of my life. And we see that perspective of a child that spent a day with their dad. Don't know what they talked about. Don't know what else, but they fished together. They spent time together. And he said, it was the most glorious day of my life.
30 years later, Henry had been writing about that and talking about that day because it had meant a lot to him. And after his father passed, they found all of his journals, and Henry had the idea to take his father's journal and compare what his father wrote on that day with what he had written on that day. And as he opened up excitedly his father's journal, and he looked at the words that his father had penned, his father said, "Went fishing with my son. A day wasted." And I can just imagine the hurt and the pain that would have caused poor Henry as he reads that, to realize a moment that was important to him, a moment that meant a lot to him, that his dad was wishing he was somewhere else, that his dad wished that he hadn't wasted that time. And I want to encourage you this morning, fathers, don't waste the time, and don't see time with your children as a waste, because it's not. Every moment that you have to spend with them is an opportunity. Every time that you can speak to them and teach them and train them, you can help lead them towards that mark that you're trying to shoot them for. Don't fail them. Your children are looking to you to be their hero. They're looking to you to be their leader. Don't fail them. Take the time. Seize the opportunity. And be the fathers that God has called you to be. God bless you.